Get this, the way I got clued into my ex pulling the sheets over on me was about as screwed up as it gets. We're talking top-tier Hall of Fame level revelation of betrayal here, folks. One of those life-altering experiences that slaps a scarlet letter on your soul, inducting you into that god-awful club where the membership fees are pain and self-doubt. The memory still rings loud and clear. My former sister-in-law's quivering voice, looping "I'm sorry" through the phone speaker like a broke record. I'd just wrapped up a work trip, motoring back home without a care in the world. Her frantic apologies left me utterly baffled, at least until she sucked in a breath and dropped the bombshell. My wife was laid up in the hospital and I needed to burn rush hour traffic getting back ASAP. Well, shit. My brain kicked into overdrive trying to fathom what fresh hell awaited me. The only crumb she bothered feeding me before abruptly hanging up? Some vague intimation about an assault. So there I was, peeling out and praying to any deity listening that it wasn't too serious a situation. Despite my mind whirling with worst-case scenarios, I pictured something along the lines of a mugging or robbery gone sideways. Little did I know, the actual truth would make those grim imaginings look mild in comparison. I careen into the hospital parking lot in record time, chest pounding like a jackhammer. That's when this state trooper buddy of my sister-in-law's shepherds me off to the side, clearly wrestling with how to gently lay some harsh truth bare. Beating around the bush wasn't an option, though. Not when the tale involved my supposedly devoted wife catching a savage beating, courtesy of the side piece she'd been laying pipe with behind my back. Yep, you read that right. The supposed assault was actually my beautiful bride-to-be, tasting the bitter sting of infidelity. My brain outright rebelled at the notion. Let me tell you, how does a man even begin processing that level of deception from his soulmate? This cop could sense my disbelief. He fired me a somber look, placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, and laid it out plain. The battered girlfriend was, in fact, my lawfully wedded wife. I felt the earth shake violently underfoot as the bottom dropped out of my reality. Of course, seeing the state she was in with my own two eyes carved those images permanently into my psyche's scarred landscape. One moment, I'm drinking in her pulverized face, jawline askew and one eye swollen shut amidst an ocean of darkening bruises. The next, some white coat is shattering what tattered shreds remained of my peace of mind by revealing she carried the ultimate symbolic emblem of her indiscretion, harbored the spawn of her extramarital tryst. I'll spare you the vivid recounting of how my brain rebooted trying to parse that fresh hell. Her sister seemed hell-bent on searing holes through the linoleum at that point. The state trooper had to bark at her to start unburdening herself of all the sordid details she'd been concealing. How my wife's low-life ex had slithered back into her orbit under the ruse of self-betterment. How he systematically chipped away at the foundation of her security and seeded insecurities until she fell for his phony redemption act hook, line, and sinker. About how it started with an illicit emotional entanglement that her own sister encouraged my wife to just get out of her system. How that despicable path quickly progressed into a full-blown carnal fling within 3 months, complete with her sibling providing cover stories so my wife could sneak off and lay with that wretched cur. As her sister unloaded this mountain of ugly truths, I could feel the rage bubbling up from the pit of my gut. The kind of molten fury that makes a man want to put his fist through drywall, you know? My mind was whiplashing between unbridled anger and soul-crushing heartbreak with each new revelation. My wife's skeezy ex worming his way back into her life under some bogus redemption con, hunching on that line about making amends to people he'd wronged just to get his clutches back into her. Textbook predator shit if you ask me. And her own flesh and blood enabling that slimeball's emotional erosion by telling my wife to just get it out of her system? What a crock of bull. I wanted to grab her sister by the shoulders and shake some damn sense into her. According to her blubbering account, that was the gasoline-soaked tinder that set off a raging wildfire of betrayal. An innocent coffee catch-up quickly metastasized into an out-and-out romantic affair within a couple months' time. While I was busting my hump to provide for us, My wife got so deep into her feeing sharing with Mr. Ski's ex that she started slipping between those cheap motel sheets with him. Her sister claims she thought it was just a temporary backslide, That once my wife got those lingering feelings for her abusive ex out of her system, she'd wake up and cut that cancer out for good. Clearly, sis overestimated her moral fiber because the lying and sneaking around only escalated over the following 3 months. Next thing I knew, my wife's traitorous sister was actively covering for her by providing bang bro alibis whenever she wanted to go rub naffs with Ski's ex behind my back. Can you believe the audacity of those two? Treating me like a grade A chump while my wife carried on her sick affair a stone's throw away. Hearing those filthy revelations slowly trickle out of her sister's mouth made me feel more violated than I thought possible. Every fresh detail was like another crushing haymaker hitting me square in the gut. By the time she got to how the pregnancy was actually Ski's ex's parting gift, I'm surprised I didn't crack a tooth from clenching my jaw so hard. That's when the waterworks really cut loose from my former sister-in-law. She devolved into a slobbering mess, desperately apologizing while trying to explain how she never knew the full extent of the abuse my wife had endured during her previous relationship. As if that feeble excuse could somehow absolve her of the unforgivable sin of watching my world burn without even flicking her bick. Numbness creeped up my spine as she babbled more half-baked apologies and justifications about just wanting to see my wife find peace. By that point, I honestly couldn't hear her words anymore, just an incessant, hollow buzzing filling my ear canals while I dissociated harder than a PTSD-riddled soldier. When the dust finally settled, I became keenly aware that my wife had finally roused from her restrained slumber. Laying eyes on her newly reanimated body was like being sucker-punched by reality all over again. Tears flooded down her swollen, battered cheeks the moment our gazes connected. A kaleidoscope of emotions flash-fired across her bruised features. Shame, regret, fear, self-loathing. In that moment, I realized the woman I had married was well and truly dead. From that point on, I basically ran on autopilot for months. Go through the motions at work, come home, rinse and repeat. Like some kind of souped-up zombie extra shuffling through the apocalyptic wasteland of my shattered dreams. You feel me? Her family pitched this big old song and dance about seeking counseling, both individually for her and then couples therapy for us. I guess they were still clinging to some naive hope that we could untangle that unholy knot of lies and betrayal. Can't blame them for trying, I suppose. Though in my mind, the marriage had been lethally ventilated the second I saw the aftermath of her tryst gone nuclear plastered across her mangled mug. Honestly, I'm still amazed I managed to avoid pulling a total incredible Hulk meltdown after digesting those gut-punching confessions from her sister. The counselors definitely earned their salt, attempting to wrestle that untamed beast of unbridled rage and despair raging within me. To her credit, I guess, my ex-wife didn't hold back or toss up any more smokescreens during those drained therapy sessions. She chronicled the sordid specifics of how she allowed her scumbag ex to slither back into her orbit under the putrid guise of self-improvement. How he inceptioned his way through the residual traumatized corridors of her psyche with his fake-ass redemption narrative. Apparently, after sucking her back into his orbit, it wasn't long before Mr. Ski's ex had my wife enthusiastically guzzling that tainted Kool-Aid all over again. She copped to harboring some deep-rooted desire to make peace with his past transgressions, no matter how masochistic or self-destructive it seemed to an outsider. Her words, not mine. According to her sob story admissions, she somehow rationalized indulging the creep who had habitually dehumanized her during their previous fiery dumpster of a relationship, as if re-engaging her abuser in any capacity could possibly qualify as making peace. More like asking to be battered and degraded all over again, if you ask me. Maybe that's an uncharitable view, I don't know. All I knew was that hearing her voice quaver and break while reliving how she'd fantasized about driving her shame-stained self into a river, just to purge her conscience of his lingering stench, .. it just gutted me, man. admitting she only finally grabbed those slippery shards of sanity after discovering she was carrying his spawn? Well, that certainly added an extra depressing layer of phew and ked up to an already you and Turley foobar situation. Therapy allowed me to witness her transformation into a hollow, haunted shadow up close and personal too. The vivid deterioration played out in agonizing slow motion right before my eyes. One session she could barely bring herself to meet my scrutinizing gaze. Next she'd be a jittery mess, losing her ashen complexion just sitting across the room from our male counselor. Before long, the mere thought of being separated from my side for even a moment would trigger panicked spirals, the aftershocks from her ex's monstrous behavior continuously detonating like seismic depth charges. I'm not too proud to admit I shed my fair share of tears throughout that protracted, painful process too. Not necessarily for the death of our fractured marriage, but more so for the once bright, compassionate soul of the woman I'd fallen for being so utterly crushed under the weight of her self-destructive choices. Gut-wrenching stuff, witnessing someone you've loved unravel into a frayed tapestry of crippling anxieties and obsessive self-loathing up close like that, you know? Maybe that's what made pulling the ripcord inevitable once her pregnancy reached full term. Don't get me twisted. My son lit up those tattered ashes of paternal love smoldering deep within. But he couldn't douse the wildfire of disgust and loathing I felt each time I laid eyes upon his mother's haunted visage. She had become an inextricable tether shackling me to the trauma and violation her choices had wrought. So, I made the agonizing decision to amputate that anchor, weighing me into the abyss. Despite her desperate, unbecoming pleas to stay, her sick offers to indulge my vengeful urges through some depraved twist on ethical non-monogamy, I refused to permit that soulless charade of reconciliation to fester any longer. We hastily disentangled the remaining legal knots of our ill-fated union, her compliance throughout, likely driven by the same wellspring of self-loathing I'd witnessed her drinking from in therapy. For a while there, I was very much the definition of a textbook broken man, just trudging through the motions of existence. Work became a daily refuge of robotic routine to numb my mind from dwelling on the catastrophic crater where my life used to reside. Outside of performing those familiar job functions on autopilot, I was utterly adrift, a lost soul ricocheting through a fog of grief, anger, and crippling self-doubt. In quieter moments of desperation, sure, I entertained some pretty dark thoughts and urges no sane person should ever have to grapple with. Can't deny the intrusive flashes of violent, scorched earth vengeance that would fester in the recesses of my psyche from time to time, or the bitter despondency whispering sweetly about shortcuts to opt out of this living hell altogether. It was an ugly, primordial plane of torment that reached its bony fingers into the depths of my fractured being more often than I care to admit. Thankfully, my wonderful son became the lone tether mooring me to reality during that bleak period of ceaseless inner tumult. Focusing every shred of my existence into being as loving and supportive as a newly single father possibly could, helped provide just enough forward inertia to escape getting hopelessly mired in those shadowy abysses. His bright-eyed, innocent adoration was the solitary ray of pure sunlight piercing the all-consuming darkness threatening to swallow me whole. Of course, the unfortunate flip side was having to still interact with my ex on a semi-regular basis for custody handoffs and co-parenting matters. An unavoidable torture of being forced to lay eyes upon the shattered, shambling visage wearing the ill-fitting skin of the woman I once loved. Those first few encounters after our separation were just utter chaos, brimming with enough awkward, heated tension to power a dozen thermonuclear reactors. My ex always looked like she'd been wandering the desert for weeks without pause each time I saw her, gaunt, haunted, practically feral. The deterioration of her outer appearance merely a visible logarithm charting her accelerated psychological decline in the aftermath of her infidelity being uncovered so traumatically. She'd inevitably devolve into incoherent hysterics anytime I so much as made eye contact, digging freshly exposed nerves in herself with repeated self-flagellation. Part of me understood I was observing the ruinous endgame of deeply rooted traumas she'd never properly healed from. The rest of me, however, couldn't muster an iota of empathy watching this pitiable wretch of a woman beating herself bloody against the devastating consequences her despicable choices had wrought. An uncharitable stance, I'm sure, but an honest one given the all-consuming maelstrom of hurt still roiling through my very marrow. Those initial months of co-parenting could aptly be described as walking a tightrope between hell's unforgiving inferno and purgatory's icy, unending void. Almost cruelly, her episodes waxed and waned in their intensity without any discernible pattern. Some custody handoffs would pass by with little more than the suffocating silence of two caged animals regarding one another warily from opposite ends of their shared prison. Others devolved into screaming matches or were derailed entirely by her unyielding, inconsolable breakdowns. I'd be lying if I claimed to never lose my own tenuous grasp on restraint during the worst of those draining gauntlets of psychological warfare. More than a few times I succumbed to the scalding hot urges of helpless rage, venting years of pent-up vitriol with volleys of verbal venom meant to cut as deeply as the still oozing lacerations in my soul. Anytime she dared raise a trembling hand to make physical contact, I instinctively recoiled like her fingertips were branding irons fashioned in the pits of perdition itself. Even worse were the sporadic occasions where my ex's hysteria would bleed over to disrupt the tranquility of my few remaining respites. Poisonous darts of desperation fired haphazardly at my meditation sessions or impromptu karaoke sessions with friends. Text tirades and alcohol-fueled voicemail browbeatings filled with bitter, unhinged screeds of recrimination I'm still repressing to this day. Never pleasant interactions, but survivable nonetheless thanks to my support system's steadfast assistance in maintaining vital boundaries. The final descent into sheer madness didn't commence until a couple years had passed, though. What commenced as spiteful drive-by heckling from a respectable distance metastasized into outright harassment and stalking once I finally mustered the courage and self-worth to dip my toes back into the dating scene. My ex's meltdowns instantly spiraled from merely disturbing to outright petrifying to witness. I should have seen videos chronicling a budding storm system's turbulent formation. What began as just isolated clusters of unsettling cloud coverage rapidly amassed into a full-blown psychological supercell, rife with untamed lightning strikes of mania lashing out indiscriminately. Those initial drive-by rants and amboon the warning signs, you know? In hindsight, her escalating erratic behavior was like one of those time-lapse she's quickly shed any pretense of seeking closure or reconciliation too. The unhinged verbal assault started carrying a palpable undercurrent of seething possessive resentment, awash with threats, both implied and overt, about ensuring I remained shackled to my personal purgatory of loneliness and regret. Like she'd been lying in wait, a coiled viper yearning to strike the moment I showed even the faintest glimmer of potentially moving on with my life. Most unsettling of all, however, was the sense that I was somehow still the deranged fixation fueling each and every one of these unnerving outbursts. A feeling not rooted in delusions of ego, mind you, but an instinctive knowledgeable her fractured psyche had affixed a perverse, obsessive attachment onto memories of our ill-fated partnership. As if part of her had become trapped in an endless, looping purgatory, replaying our initial whirlwind romance on a ceaseless cycle, conveniently omitting the traumatic implosion that brought the curtain crashing down. Of course. I'd be lying if I claimed to feel zero residual guilt or conflicting emotions over her increasingly precarious unraveling. Part of me still clung to faded, nostalgic wisps about the wonderful woman I fell for initially before, well, everything. A hopelessly naive part yearned for some closure, perhaps. A tidy ending to finally exorcise the ghosts dwelling in that haunted threshold between what was and what could have been. Mostly, though, I just wished she'd accept I was finally ready to move forward by leaving me in peace. When I finally mustered up the nerve to start testing the proverbial waters by agreeing to a few casual dates, it genuinely felt like an exhilarating first gasp of fresh air after years spent suffocating. Don't get me wrong, each foray willfully venturing back into romantic vulnerability carried its own inner maelstrom of anxieties to wrestle into submission. Those first flutters of emotional intimacy, ceded to someone new, were equal parts terrifying and euphorically intoxicating for my war-weary heart. I know. That all probably sounds so trite and cliché. Just another sad sap doling out a romanticized redemption arc about flipping heartbreak into an awakening of self-actualization, blah blah blah. Except this time, IT actually kind of held true, you know? With each successive attempt at reclaiming some semblance of my old dating confidence, I steadily regained crucial fragments of the easygoing, optimistic person I've worked oh so hard to rebottle. The funhouse mirror warped perception of my self-worth gradually detwisted until I could recognize and appreciate my strengths and positive attributes once again. That's what made my ex-wife's unrelenting crusade to sabotage those crucial strides down the path of healing all the more insidious and disheartening. Rather than express any hint of happiness for me reclaiming autonomy over my destiny, she seemed to flat out resent me for it on a primal, pathological level. Almost like she'd been counting on me remaining an emotionally devastated recluse perpetually mired in our failed marriage's wreckage to garner some vicarious sense of validation. Instead, each microscopic step forward I took became twisted into sprawling manifestos about desecrating the sanctity of the bond we once shared. Feverish rants lambasting my betrayal, filled with word salads attempting to gaslight me into believing some revisionist fairy tale version of our romance that never truly existed outside her shattered psyche. Emotional torture tactics grasping at any stray thread of residual doubt left unsevered, aimed at unraveling my painstaking progress in reclaiming my autonomy. The breaking point finally shattered when I managed to cultivate an actual committed relationship for the first time since the divorce's fallout. Eager to share the momentous, hard-won milestone with those nearest and dearest, I decided to divulge the joyous news to my son first. His childhood glee quickly dissipated into confusion, however, when informing his mother of my happy announcement somehow triggered her most unhinged, unsettling outburst yet. I'll never forget the sheer look of horror contorting my son's innocent features as he recounted what unfolded after passing along my happy news. The way his little voice quivered while rehashing those traumatic memories still haunts me to this day. According to him, his mother didn't even attempt masking her unstable reaction upon learning I'd moved on romantically. The damn near feral howls of anguish echoing through their home left him cowering in a corner, desperately trying to muffle the sounds with his hands clamped over his ears. Treasured keepsakes and picture frames exploding against the walls as each new convulsion of rage seized her. At one point, she allegedly collapsed into a heap, clawing at her scalp until clumps of hair were left intertwined in her whitening knuckles. When her volcanic fury finally started waning after God knows how long, my son emerged from hiding to find his mother disheveled and catatonic, rocking back and forth while mumbling the same two phrases over and over like a lapsed tape loop. "Our tree! He defiled our tree! This isn't over, ... It will never be over." Harrowing shit, right? I'd be lying if I claimed her outburst didn't trigger my own panicked spiral of unease and trepidation after absorbing those haunting details. Part of me kept replaying those final ominous murmurs on a continuous cycle, wondering if they constituted a legitimate threat or were simply the ramblings of someone who had irrevocably severed their tenuous grasp on reality. Either way, the experience undoubtedly crossed a line, transforming her erratic obsession from unsettling inconvenience into a legitimate source of potential danger for my loved ones. I realized harsh measures would need to be taken to finally extricate myself and my newfound happiness from the toxic orbit of her psychological black hole before it consumed us all. Unfortunately, my initial attempts at reaching common ground fell on willingly deaf ears. Every carefully worded voicemail pleading for her to stand down got answered with increasingly deranged diatribes filled with possessive non sequiturs and incomprehensible metaphors. Frankly, I'm still not entirely sure whether she somehow deluded herself into viewing our relationship's ultimate dissolution as some great cosmic betrayal, or if she'd simply gone full tilt into constructing an alternate fantasy where we were eternally destined to be together despite all evidence to the contrary. When demands for her to respect clearly established boundaries and cease all harassment failed, I had no choice but to pursue legal recourse. The restraining order certainly helped quell her most extreme outbursts and gave me some much-needed breathing room to attempt repairing the emotional scars her actions had inflicted on our son. But even from a court-enforced distance, her presence lingered like a debilitating sense of dread, clouding the periphery. An omnipresent killjoy reigning on any small shred of newfound happiness or peace that dared take root. Which ... brings me to today, I suppose. Telling this story from beginning to end, reliving those gut-punching moments of shock and devastation with fresh eyes. Plenty of ups and downs along the way, for sure, but each crucible has hardened my resolve to not remain endlessly shackled by the past. My amazing fiancé has played an immeasurable role in helping me persevere through the darkness and find the light waiting on the other side. Do I still harbor lingering doubts or experience the occasional anxiety spiral, wondering if my ex will somehow violation the order and come unraveled again? Of course, that traumatic conditioning runs deep after the unrelenting psychological warfare she's waged. But I'm working on trusting that the legal repercussions and our solid support system will help keep her at bay this time. My new lease on life is too precious to surrender over to her toxic vortex ever again. More importantly, I've finally reached a point where I'm able to look back at the shattered adlerations of my previous marriage and find peace with its fiery conclusion. While unspeakably painful in the moment, the truth is that woman I fell for was slowly bled dry by cumulative poor decisions long before her infidelity ignited everything to cinder. Setting aside the betrayal's emotional devastation, she demonstrated a willingness to not only condone, but abet her partner's depravity, which disqualifies her from victim status in my eyes, at least regarding our interpersonal reckoning. So where does that leave us now? Stubbornly persevering with unconditional optimism, as always, allowing the past's damning phantoms to dissipate into the rear view so my present focus can remain centered on cultivating the loving future my fiancé and I are meticulously building together. No matter what new shitstorms life has in store, I've steeled my resolve to weather them and emerge unbowed on the other side. Our resilience will not be broken, not by her, not by anyone.